The day my life changed forever after a single decision. The day my life changed forever after a single decision. I didn't think much of it at the time, it was just a small choice, something that seemed almost insignificant, something people do every day without a second thought. It was a late autumn afternoon, one of those gloomy days where the sun barely breaks through the clouds and everything feels a little surreal, a little too quiet. I'd just gotten off work, the stress of the day pressing down on me, the usual parade of meetings, emails, and endless deadlines buzzing in my head. I was exhausted, hungry, and ready to go home and lose myself in a quiet evening. As I walked to my car, I noticed an older man standing just outside the parking lot, a weary look on his face, holding a piece of paper in his hand. He looked lost, out of place in his ragged clothes and faded baseball cap, his hands trembling as he glanced around like he was trying to find something or someone. Part of me wanted to just keep walking, to pretend I hadn't seen him and go home to unwind. But something tugged at me, a nagging feeling I couldn't shake, telling me to stop, to at least ask if he needed help. I'd heard enough horror stories to know that approaching strangers alone wasn't always the smartest move, especially after dark, but this man looked genuinely helpless. So I made the choice, the one decision that would change everything. I approached him and asked if he needed help finding something. He looked up at me with a mixture of surprise and relief, his voice shaky as he explained that he was trying to find a hospital nearby. His daughter had just been in an accident, he said, and he'd rushed over as soon as he heard, but he'd gotten lost along the way. He showed me the piece of paper with an address scribbled on it, but I recognized immediately that the hospital he was looking for was across town, at least a half-hour drive. He didn't have a phone, or a GPS, and I could see he was too frail to make the trip alone, let alone in the emotional state he was in. I hesitated, the logical part of me screaming that it was a bad idea, that I should call someone else to help him, maybe a taxi or the police, but he looked so defeated, so desperate, that I couldn't bring myself to walk away. I told him I'd take him to the hospital. We drove in silence, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional sniffle from him as he stared out the window, lost in worry. I could feel the tension, the heavy weight of his fear filling the car. When we finally arrived at the hospital, he thanked me, his voice thick with gratitude, and hurried inside. I sat there for a moment, unsure if I should leave or wait to see if he needed anything else. I decided to wait, reasoning that he might need a ride home or some kind of support. An hour passed, then two, and just as I was about to leave, he returned, looking even more distraught than before. He explained that his daughter's condition had taken a turn for the worse and that he didn't know anyone else in the area, that he felt completely alone. My heart went out to him, and I knew then that I couldn't just abandon him. I offered to stay with him, to wait until he knew more. The hours blurred together as we sat in that hospital waiting room, trading stories to pass the time, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about his daughter, how she was the light of his life, how he'd never imagined he'd be sitting here, not knowing if she'd make it. I shared some stories from my own life, trying to distract him, to give him a moment of peace in the midst of his turmoil. It was close to dawn when a doctor finally came out to speak with him. I watched as his face crumbled, as he sank into a chair, the weight of the news hitting him like a physical blow. She hadn't made it. I didn't know what to say, how to offer comfort to a man who'd just lost everything. I stayed with him as he made arrangements, as he tried to come to terms with the reality of his loss. Eventually, he thanked me again, this time with tears in his eyes, and told me that he didn't know what he would have done if I hadn't been there. I went home feeling raw, my mind racing with everything that had happened, every detail etched into my memory. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been meant to help him, that fate had somehow pushed me to make that one choice, to be there for a stranger in his darkest hour. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to normal. But I felt different, changed by that single night, by that decision to stop and help when I could have walked away. Then, one day, I received a letter in the mail from the man. Inside was a small note, thanking me once again, telling me that his daughter had always believed in acts of kindness, in the idea that we're all connected, that one small act can make a world of difference. Along with the note was a check, a large sum of money he'd insisted on giving me as a token of his gratitude. I didn't want to accept it, but there was something in his words, in his belief in the goodness of people, that made me realize how deeply he'd been affected by that night. I kept the check, but instead of spending it, I used it to start a small foundation in his daughter's name, dedicated to helping people in need, to offering support in those unexpected moments when life changes in an instant. The foundation grew over time, each new person we helped becoming part of the legacy that had started with a single decision, a single choice to help someone in need. Looking back now, I can't help but wonder how different my life would be if I'd ignored that man, if I'd gone home that night and forgotten all about him. That single decision led to so much more than I could have ever imagined, to a purpose I never would have found otherwise. It changed my life in ways I can't fully explain, leaving me with a sense of connection, of meaning, that goes beyond anything I'd felt before. And all because of one choice, one moment of kindness, one night that turned into something far greater than I could have ever anticipated. I overheard a life-changing secret at a party. It was supposed to be an ordinary night, just a friend's housewarming party in a neighborhood that was a little too upscale, with the kind of crowd that looked more at home in a magazine spread than in real life. I'd almost skipped it altogether, exhausted from a long week, but something about the invitation had intrigued me. Maybe it was the vague promise of unforgettable surprises, or maybe it was just that itch to escape my usual routine. So, there I was, mingling awkwardly, sipping my drink as I wandered from group to group, feeling like an outsider among people who seemed to have it all figured out. I didn't know many people there, but everyone seemed connected, as though there was some invisible thread binding them together in a way I didn't quite understand. That's when I noticed a small room off to the side, dimly lit, with the door cracked open just enough to catch a glimpse inside. Curiosity got the better of me, and I drifted toward it, peeking inside. There was a man and a woman standing close, their voices low, urgent. I couldn't help but eavesdrop, my hand frozen on the door frame as their conversation unfolded, and in that moment, I felt like I'd stumbled into something I was never meant to hear. The man, whom I recognized as one of the hosts, was whispering frantically about something that sounded like a mistake from years ago, a mistake that he said he could never make right. He kept saying that he couldn't let anyone find out, that if this secret got out, his life would be over. The woman was trying to calm him down, but her own voice trembled with fear, as though she knew the weight of what they were discussing. I didn't understand everything they were saying, but then he mentioned something about a family member, a child who wasn't his, a lie that had somehow spiraled out of control. My mind raced, piecing together bits of their conversation, and suddenly I realized they were talking about something so big, so deeply personal, that it had the power to unravel lives, destroy relationships, tear families apart. The man's voice cracked as he confessed that he'd kept this secret for nearly 20 years, that he'd never planned on revealing it, but recent events had brought it all back to the surface, and he didn't know what to do. I felt a pang of dread in my stomach, the kind of unease that you can't quite explain, that tells you something is terribly wrong. I should have walked away then, pretended I hadn't heard anything, gone back to the party and left these strangers to their twisted mess. But I couldn't move, frozen by the gravity of what I'd just overheard. I didn't know these people, didn't know their story, but suddenly I felt as though I was tangled in their web, as though I had become part of this secret, whether I wanted to be or not. After a few more moments of whispered desperation, they left the room, both of them looking pale and haunted, and I quickly ducked away, pretending to examine a painting on the wall as they passed by. The rest of the night was a blur, the drinks tasted bitter, the laughter around me felt hollow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just crossed a line, stepped into a world that was darker than I could have imagined. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying their conversation, the sheer weight of their words pressing down on me. I didn't know what to do with this knowledge, didn't know if I could just forget what I'd heard. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to push it all to the back of my mind, but every time I saw a family laughing together, every time I heard someone talk about trust, or loyalty, or betrayal, the memory would resurface, gnawing at me, haunting me. I started to feel like I was carrying their secret, like it had somehow bled into my own life, staining everything it touched. One day, out of sheer desperation, I decided to confront the host, to tell him what I'd heard and demand an explanation. I didn't know what I'd say or what I hoped to achieve, but I couldn't keep carrying this alone. I tracked him down, cornered him in a quiet cafe, and as soon as he saw me, he knew why I was there. He didn't try to deny it or make excuses. Instead, he just looked at me with a kind of resigned acceptance, as though he'd been expecting this day to come. He told me everything, filling in the gaps of what I'd overheard that night. The child he'd spoken of was his son, but not biologically. He'd raised the boy as his own, never revealing the truth to anyone, not even to his wife. The real father had been his best friend, who died in a tragic accident, and he'd made a promise to protect the secret, to keep the child safe, no matter the cost. But now the boy, a young man in his 20s, was asking questions, digging into his past, and the host was terrified that the truth would come out, that his carefully constructed life would collapse around him. He looked at me with pleading eyes, asking me if I could understand why he'd done it, why he'd lied to everyone, why he'd built his life on a foundation of secrets. I didn't know how to respond, didn't know if I could ever truly understand. But I realized then that this secret, this burden, was something he'd carried alone for so long, something that had haunted him in ways I couldn't fully grasp. I walked away from that meeting feeling both heavier and lighter, as though I'd taken a piece of his burden with me, yet somehow freed myself from its grip. I knew then that I could never reveal his secret, that it wasn't mine to share, that I'd stumbled into this world by accident and it wasn't my place to disrupt it. In the end, I never told anyone else what I'd overheard that night. But the experience changed me, made me see people differently, made me understand that everyone carries hidden scars, that we're all fighting battles no one else can see. And even now, years later, I think back to that night, to that secret I overheard, and I wonder if it's still buried, still hidden, or if the truth has finally come to light. Either way, I know that it's not my story to tell, it's a ghost that will haunt me forever, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. I overheard a life-changing secret at a party. It was supposed to be an ordinary night, just a friend's housewarming party in a neighborhood that was a little too upscale, with the kind of crowd that looked more at home in a magazine spread than in real life. I'd almost skipped it altogether, exhausted from a long week, but something about the invitation had intrigued me. Maybe it was the vague promise of unforgettable surprises, or maybe it was just that itch to escape my usual routine. So, there I was, mingling awkwardly, sipping my drink as I wandered from group to group, feeling like an outsider among people who seemed to have it all figured out. I didn't know many people there, but everyone seemed connected, as though there was some invisible thread binding them together in a way I didn't quite understand. That's when I noticed a small room off to the side, dimly lit, with the door cracked open just enough to catch a glimpse inside. Curiosity got the better of me, and I drifted toward it, peeking inside. There was a man and a woman standing close, their voices low, urgent. I couldn't help but eavesdrop, my hand frozen on the door frame as their conversation unfolded, and in that moment, I felt like I'd stumbled into something I was never meant to hear. The man, whom I recognized as one of the hosts, was whispering frantically about something that sounded like a mistake from years ago, a mistake that he said he could never make right. He kept saying that he couldn't let anyone find out, that if this secret got out, his life would be over. The woman was trying to calm him down, but her own voice trembled with fear, as though she knew the weight of what they were discussing. I didn't understand everything they were saying, but then he mentioned something about a family member, a child who wasn't his, a lie that had somehow spiraled out of control. My mind raced, piecing together bits of their conversation, and suddenly I realized they were talking about something so big, so deeply personal, that it had the power to unravel lives, destroy relationships, tear families apart. The man's voice cracked as he confessed that he'd kept this secret for nearly 20 years, that he'd never planned on revealing it, but recent events had brought it all back to the surface, and he didn't know what to do. I felt a pang of dread in my stomach, the kind of unease that you can't quite explain, that tells you something is terribly wrong. I should have walked away then, pretended I hadn't heard anything, gone back to the party and left these strangers to their twisted mess. But I couldn't move, frozen by the gravity of what I'd just overheard. I didn't know these people, didn't know their story, but suddenly I felt as though I was tangled in their web, as though I had become part of this secret, whether I wanted to be or not. After a few more moments of whispered desperation, they left the room, both of them looking pale and haunted, and I quickly ducked away, pretending to examine a painting on the wall as they passed by. The rest of the night was a blur, the drinks tasted bitter, the laughter around me felt hollow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just crossed a line, stepped into a world that was darker than I could have imagined. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying their conversation, the sheer weight of their words pressing down on me. I didn't know what to do with this knowledge, didn't know if I could just forget what I'd heard. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to push it all to the back of my mind, but every time I saw a family laughing together, every time I heard someone talk about trust, or loyalty, or betrayal, the memory would resurface, gnawing at me, haunting me. I started to feel like I was carrying their secret, like it had somehow bled into my own life, staining everything it touched. One day, out of sheer desperation, I decided to confront the host, to tell him what I'd heard and demand an explanation. I didn't know what I'd say or what I hoped to achieve, but I couldn't keep carrying this alone. I tracked him down, cornered him in a quiet cafe, and as soon as he saw me, he knew why I was there. He didn't try to deny it or make excuses. Instead, he just looked at me with a kind of resigned acceptance, as though he'd been expecting this day to come. He told me everything, filling in the gaps of what I'd overheard that night. The child he'd spoken of was his son, but not biologically. He'd raised the boy as his own, never revealing the truth to anyone, not even to his wife. The real father had been his best friend, who died in a tragic accident, and he'd made a promise to protect the secret, to keep the child safe, no matter the cost. But now the boy, a young man in his 20s, was asking questions, digging into his past, and the host was terrified that the truth would come out, that his carefully constructed life would collapse around him. He looked at me with pleading eyes, asking me if I could understand why he'd done it, why he'd lied to everyone, why he'd built his life on a foundation of secrets. I didn't know how to respond, didn't know if I could ever truly understand. But I realized then that this secret, this burden, was something he'd carried alone for so long, something that had haunted him in ways I couldn't fully grasp. I walked away from that meeting feeling both heavier and lighter, as though I'd taken a piece of his burden with me, yet somehow freed myself from its grip. I knew then that I could never reveal his secret, that it wasn't mine to share, that I'd stumbled into this world by accident and it wasn't my place to disrupt it. In the end, I never told anyone else what I'd overheard that night. But the experience changed me, made me see people differently, made me understand that everyone carries hidden scars, that we're all fighting battles no one else can see. And even now, years later, I think back to that night, to that secret I overheard, and I wonder if it's still buried, still hidden, or if the truth has finally come to light. Either way, I know that it's not my story to tell, it's a ghost that will haunt me forever, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. Why I refused to help a friend in need, a controversial choice. A few months ago, I was faced with a decision that's haunted me ever since, a choice that still makes my heart race every time I think about it. It was one of those situations where everything inside me was screaming that something was wrong, yet everyone around me insisted I should just go along with it. My friend, Alex, had reached out to me after months of no contact. We'd been close once, best friends even, but he had drifted into a different world, one I couldn't quite reach. His life had spiraled out of control, and he'd become increasingly unpredictable, shutting out everyone who tried to help him. I hadn't heard from him in nearly a year, until late one night, my phone lit up with his name, an unexpected message out of the blue. "I need your help," it read, a simple request with no explanation. My first instinct was to brush it off, thinking he was probably up to something reckless, maybe a new scheme that wouldn't end well. But a sense of unease crept in, a feeling I couldn't shake, and despite everything, I found myself messaging him back, asking what was going on. His reply was vague and cryptic, saying he was in trouble, that he couldn't explain everything over text, but he needed me to come to a remote part of town, immediately, no questions asked. I could practically feel the desperation in his words, but something didn't feel right. I asked him where he was, who he was with, and if he was in danger, but his replies were short and evasive. He kept repeating that he couldn't explain over the phone, that it was too risky, but that he really needed me. He was practically begging. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him, asking for an address, but that's when things took a turn. He told me not to tell anyone, to come alone, and to make sure I wasn't followed. It all sounded like some low-budget thriller, and the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Why would he be so secretive? Why couldn't he just meet me somewhere public if he needed help? I tried calling him, but each time, he'd decline, only to text me moments later with the same plea for help. At that point, alarm bells were going off in my head. The area he wanted me to come to wasn't exactly known for being safe, especially late at night. It was a rundown part of town, the kind of place where things went unnoticed and people turned a blind eye. I texted him back, telling him I'd only come if he could give me some kind of explanation, something to make sense of the whole thing. His response was chilling, "Just trust me. I don't have anyone else. Please." The words hit me hard, bringing up memories of all the times we'd been there for each other. Part of me felt like I owed him this, like I couldn't turn my back on him. But the fear gnawed at me, a quiet, insistent dread that warned me to stay away. I confided in a mutual friend, hoping for some guidance, but he was just as baffled. He hadn't spoken to Alex in ages either and agreed that the situation seemed sketchy. If he can't even tell you what's going on, maybe it's better to stay out of it, he said, but I could tell he was conflicted too. We both knew how deep Alex's troubles ran, how he had a way of dragging people down with him. The longer I hesitated, the more messages came pouring in, each one more frantic than the last. Please, I'm begging you. Don't leave me hanging. I'm out of options. But every time I typed out a response, I found myself deleting it, unable to shake the feeling that this wasn't just about helping a friend. I felt like I was being drawn into something far darker, something that wouldn't end well for either of us. Eventually, I decided I couldn't go, that whatever trouble he was in, it was beyond what I could handle alone. I told him that he should go to the police if he was in real danger, but his response was angry, almost venomous, as if my refusal was a betrayal. You think I'd ask the cops for help? You really don't get it, do you? He accused me of abandoning him, of turning my back when he needed me most. The messages became less like pleas and more like accusations, laced with bitterness and blame. I turned off my phone that night, lying awake in bed, guilt twisting my stomach. The next morning, I learned that he'd been involved in a break-in gone wrong. The news reported that 2 men had been caught on a security camera near a warehouse, both fleeing the scene after an altercation with the guards. Alex's face was there, grainy but recognizable, his expression tense and desperate. They hadn't been caught, and his whereabouts were still unknown. A wave of relief mixed with horror washed over me. If I'd gone, would I have been dragged into that mess? Or worse, would I have been caught up in something even darker? I spent the next few days in a haze of guilt and confusion, torn between regret for abandoning him and a haunting certainty that I'd made the right choice. People in our circle found out, and the backlash was swift. Some said I should have done more, that real friends don't turn their backs. Others whispered that Alex had always been trouble, that it was only a matter of time before he crossed the line. I stopped trying to defend myself, stopped trying to explain the gut feeling I'd had, the dread that told me something was very, very wrong. Weeks went by, and I hadn't heard from him again, though the memory of that night lingered, a constant shadow in the back of my mind. I found myself scanning news reports, always half expecting to see his name again, wondering if he was still out there, angry and betrayed. One night, I received another message from an unknown number. It was Alex, and his words were cold and accusing. You left me to rot, he wrote. I'll never forget it. I didn't reply, but the guilt gnawed at me all over again, his words echoing in my mind. Sometimes, I wonder if I made a mistake, if I let fear win over friendship, but then I remember the dread I felt, that gut instinct telling me to stay away. Even now, I'm torn between feeling like I abandoned a friend in need and the overwhelming sense that I avoided something terrible. It's a decision that haunts me, a choice I'll never forget, and one I'm still not sure I'd make any differently if I had the chance. The strangest thing I found in my new apartment. Moving into a new apartment was supposed to be a fresh start, a blank slate after the chaotic end to my last relationship and the seemingly endless series of unlucky events that had plagued me. I had spent weeks searching, picking through all the usual listings, and finally found something affordable in an old brick building at the edge of the city. It was small, but cozy, with creaky wooden floors and windows that looked out over the busy street below. It had that old, lived-in feel, but nothing about it screamed stay away. I spent the first day just unpacking, listening to music, trying to make the space feel like my own. But it was that night, once the last box was broken down and the silence settled in, that I noticed something strange. The air felt thick, almost charged, and there was a faint but distinct smell, like musty books or something forgotten for too long. I tried to ignore it, figuring it was just the quirks of an old building. But when I went into the bathroom to brush my teeth, I noticed something unusual, a small metal latch, low to the ground, barely noticeable unless you were kneeling down. I knelt, curious, and gently lifted the latch, discovering a small, square hatch set into the wall. It was hidden just under the sink, blending in with the aging tile. For a moment, I hesitated, feeling a slight shiver as I looked at it. I couldn't imagine why a bathroom would need an access panel so small and so hidden, but maybe it was an old crawl space or an access point for pipes. Still, something about it seemed off. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled on the tiny handle, which gave way surprisingly easily. The hatch swung open to reveal a narrow, dark passage that seemed to lead down between the walls. I couldn't see much beyond the first few feet, but I could hear a faint dripping sound echoing up from somewhere far below. My first instinct was to close it back up, forget I'd seen it, and call it a weird old building quirk. But that eerie curiosity pulled at me, the kind of curiosity that makes you do something even when you know you probably shouldn't. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and knelt down to peer inside. The beam of light revealed a cramped, dusty crawl space with walls covered in strange, faint marks, as though someone had scratched symbols or drawings into the plaster long ago. They looked like abstract figures, almost childlike, but there was a disturbing edge to them, something that made my stomach twist as I shined the light down further. The air grew colder, and that strange smell became more intense, like dampness mixed with something metallic. Suddenly, I heard a soft rustling, like the sound of something shifting in the dark. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to back away, but I stayed, staring into the shadows as the rustling grew louder, closer. My hand shook as I kept the flashlight steady, and that's when I saw it, a small bundle, wrapped tightly in what looked like old cloth, tucked just out of reach. I reached in, my fingers brushing against the rough fabric, and pulled it closer. The bundle was heavier than I expected, and the cloth had a strange, sticky texture that clung to my skin, leaving a faint, dark residue. Heart pounding, I unwrapped it slowly, revealing an old, leather-bound notebook, battered and worn with age. The cover was blank, but the pages inside were filled with spidery handwriting, cramped and frantic. Most of it was incoherent rambling, words that made no sense, references to things I couldn't understand. But as I flipped through, I found drawings, grotesque sketches of faces twisted in agony, figures with hollow eyes staring out from the page. My skin crawled as I looked at them, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. On the last page, in bold, uneven letters, were the words "Do not look in the walls." I slammed the book shut, heart racing, as a sense of unease settled over me. What had I stumbled into? My apartment suddenly felt wrong, as though I was intruding on something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. I shoved the book back into the bundle, closed the hatch, and tried to forget about it, but that night, I barely slept. Every creak, every whisper of wind, every shadow seemed to take on a life of its own, and I kept imagining those twisted faces, those hollow eyes staring back at me. Over the next few days, I tried to go on as normal, but strange things kept happening. Objects would move on their own, lights flickered unpredictably, and that smell lingered, no matter how much I cleaned. Once, I heard faint scratching coming from the walls, like something alive was trapped just out of sight. Desperate for answers, I asked the building manager about the history of the apartment, but he just shrugged, saying it was one of the oldest units and that no one had lived there long, most people moving out within a few months. He said it with an odd smile, almost as though he knew something he wasn't telling me. I considered leaving, but something kept me there, a strange pull I couldn't explain, as though the apartment itself had a hold on me. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping from within the walls, almost like a heartbeat. It grew louder, faster, until it seemed to echo in my skull, and I bolted upright, my pulse racing. In a trance, I found myself drawn back to that hatch, my hand reaching for the latch almost against my will. I opened it, shined my flashlight down, and there, further down the crawl space, I saw something move, a figure, hunched and twisted, with hollow eyes that stared back at me, watching, waiting. I slammed the hatch shut, heart pounding, and fled the apartment that night, never looking back. To this day, I don't know what I found in that crawl space or what was waiting for me in the walls, but I'll never forget those hollow eyes, the twisted faces in that notebook, the words scrawled in frantic desperation. And I know, deep down, that some things are meant to stay hidden, buried in the dark, beyond our reach. My awkward encounter with an old teacher, lessons learned. I hadn't thought about Mr. Foster in years, but there he was, standing in front of the dairy aisle at nearly midnight, looking as startled to see me as I was to see him. Mr. Foster was my high school history teacher, infamous for his strict demeanor and relentless discipline. He was that teacher, the one everyone quietly feared and respected, even if they didn't always like him. Back then, I hadn't exactly been his favorite, but I'd always admired his passion for teaching, even if he could be a bit intimidating. Now, though, years later, he looked different, older, worn down, his eyes hollowed by shadows, and a twitch of something I couldn't place. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, polite smiles and small talk, though his eyes never quite seemed to meet mine, always darting to something over my shoulder or down to his shoes. He asked about my life, work, if I'd kept in touch with any classmates, his tone almost too casual. I gave vague answers, trying to gauge his mood. Then he began mentioning names of classmates I hadn't thought about in years, names of students who had either clashed with him or whom he'd seemed especially hard on. It was odd, him asking about those specific people, and I felt a twinge of discomfort growing with each question. Then he asked if I'd ever felt like he'd treated us unfairly, like maybe he'd been too strict or harsh, and before I could really answer, he suddenly invited me to grab a coffee, claiming he had something to explain. Curiosity got the better of me, and I reluctantly agreed. We found a 24-hour diner nearby, and the whole way there, he seemed distracted, nervous, almost rehearsing something under his breath. Sitting across from him, I felt the atmosphere shift. He seemed less like the imposing teacher I'd once known and more like a man carrying a heavy weight. He began talking about how, as a teacher, he'd always seen potential in certain students, myself included, and how sometimes he worried he'd let that get to his head. "You were different," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial, as though he were confessing a secret he'd held for years. I nodded awkwardly, unsure of what to say. He went on, talking about how his methods may have been unconventional, but how they were necessary. Then his tone shifted, growing darker, more regretful. "There are things," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the table, "things I wish I could undo." He trailed off, his fingers drumming on the table, his face a mask of conflict. My heart started to race as he talked about ethical lines and gray areas, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't want to hear where this was going. I mumbled something about needing to leave soon, but he blocked my way, insisting I stay a little longer, as though he needed me to bear witness to whatever confession he was about to spill. Trapped, I tried to appear calm, nodding along as he spoke, all the while trying to think of a way to leave without setting him off. He leaned in, whispering, "Sometimes, you find yourself doing things you wouldn't normally do, all because you think it's right in the moment." His eyes had this haunted look, his voice wavering as if he were on the edge of a breakdown. I mumbled an excuse, something about needing the restroom, and slipped away as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I dialed my friend's number, desperate to get out. When I came back, he was sitting there, calmer, eerily so, as if purging his soul had given him peace. He thanked me, his expression almost serene, and he walked out of the diner without another word. I sat there, stunned, trying to process everything, but a part of me didn't want to dwell on it. Later, I learned from an old classmate that Mr. Foster's name had been brought up in a few school scandals, allegations of misconduct that had been quietly swept under the rug, though nothing was ever proven. It was surreal to think that this man, who I'd once respected, had carried secrets so dark, and even more chilling to realize I'd been inches away from a confession that might have changed everything I thought I knew. The memory of that night haunts me still, the uneasy feeling that I barely escaped something truly sinister. The time I tried to be a hero and it backfired. The time I tried to be a hero and it backfired. When I say I tried to be a hero, I don't mean the superhero, save the world type. I'm just your average person, someone who gets freaked out if I hear footsteps behind me in a dark alley or see a shadow move where it shouldn't. But that one night, I guess I wanted to step up, prove to myself that I wasn't some coward. It started as a regular Tuesday evening. I'd just gotten out of work and was taking the long way home to clear my head. I work at this tiny, dead-end office that feels more like a dungeon than a job, and I'd been wanting to shake up my life, do something that made me feel, I don't know, alive? So there I was, walking through the park, thinking about everything wrong with my life when I heard a faint scream echoing from a distance. At first, I tried to ignore it. Screams can be anything, right? Maybe someone saw a rat, or it was a couple messing around. But then I heard it again, sharper, filled with unmistakable fear, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I should have just kept walking, called the cops, or even run in the opposite direction, but something inside me stirred. I wanted to help, to feel like I mattered, like I could be the one to make a difference, just this once. I followed the sound, my heart pounding harder with each step, and found myself weaving through the trees, each step crunching the gravel beneath me like an alarm telling me to turn back. It was dark, the kind of darkness that presses in on you, and the park lights barely reached the spot where the scream had come from. As I got closer, I spotted a figure, no, two figures, struggling in the shadows near the edge of a secluded path. I could barely make out what was happening, but it looked like someone was trying to pull away from the grip of a much larger man. Instinct kicked in, and before I could even think about the consequences, I shouted, "Hey! Let her go." The man's head snapped in my direction, and the look he gave me froze me in place. His eyes were wild, filled with something dark, something dangerous, and for a second, I regretted every decision that had led me here. But then, the woman screamed again, desperate, pleading, and I couldn't just stand there like a deer in headlights. I lunged forward, grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a broken tree branch lying on the ground, and swung it at him. My aim was off, and he barely stumbled, but it was enough to get him to let go of her for a split second. She took off running, and for a moment, I felt this surge of triumph, like I was really making a difference. I'd actually saved someone. But that feeling was short-lived. Before I knew it, the guy turned his attention on me, and he was fast. Faster than I'd anticipated. He grabbed me by the collar and slammed me against the tree with a force that made my vision blur. "You just had to play the hero, didn't you?" He sneered, his voice low and filled with venom. I tried to struggle, but he had me pinned, his grip like iron, and I realized just how powerless I was in that moment. The adrenaline that had pushed me to act had vanished, leaving me with nothing but a sickening fear clawing at my insides. He leaned in close, his face barely inches from mine, and I could feel his hot, rancid breath against my cheek. "You should have walked away," he hissed, and I knew then that I was in real trouble. Panic took over, and I tried to fight, kicking, thrashing, doing anything to break free, but it was useless. He was too strong, too determined to make me pay for interfering. And then, just as I thought it was over, something strange happened. He released me. Just let go, like he'd lost interest. I stumbled back, gasping, clutching at my chest as I watched him walk away without another word. Relief flooded over me, mixed with confusion, but I wasn't about to question it. I turned and bolted, my legs moving faster than they ever had before. When I got home, I locked every door and window, telling myself I'd dodged a bullet. I wanted to believe it was over, that I'd never see him again, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. For days, I felt like I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows lurking where they shouldn't be. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia, maybe I was just shaken up. But then I started finding things out of place around my apartment. Small things at first, like my keys being somewhere I knew I hadn't left them or the front door being unlocked when I was sure I'd bolted it. One night, I even heard footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the unease kept growing, gnawing at me. And then, one night, I woke up to find a message scrawled on my bathroom mirror in what looked like red lipstick: "You should have stayed out of it." My blood ran cold. I knew it had to be him, the man from the park, but how had he gotten into my apartment? The locks were still in place, the windows sealed tight. I called the police, but they didn't find any signs of forced entry and dismissed it as a prank. I tried to convince myself they were right, that it was all in my head, but the fear wouldn't go away. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of someone breathing right next to me. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear, and I forced myself to open my eyes, praying it was just a nightmare. But it wasn't. There he was, standing at the foot of my bed, staring down at me with that same twisted look in his eyes. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was trapped in my own body, forced to watch as he leaned closer, a sick smile spreading across his face. "You thought you could play hero," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "But heroes always pay the price." Then he was gone, just like that, leaving me alone in the dark, trembling, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. I don't remember how long I sat there, staring at the spot where he'd been, too afraid to move. All I know is that something in me snapped that night. I couldn't keep living like this, in constant fear, waiting for him to come back. I decided to confront him, to put an end to this once and for all. I started searching the city, going back to the park, retracing my steps, hoping to find some clue, anything that could lead me to him. Days turned into weeks, and every night, I'd return home exhausted, only to find more signs that he'd been there. More messages on the mirror, my belongings rearranged, my nightmares bleeding into reality. I became obsessed, barely sleeping, barely eating, just driven by this need to make him stop, to get my life back. And then, one night, I found him. Or rather, he found me. I was walking down an empty street, my senses on high alert, when I felt a presence behind me. I didn't even have to turn around to know it was him. "You're really making this too easy," he said, his voice sending chills down my spine. I spun around, fists clenched, ready to fight, but he just laughed, a low, mocking sound that echoed down the street. "You should have left it alone," he said, his eyes gleaming with something sinister. "But you wanted to be a hero. Now you get to live with the consequences." And just like that, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving me standing there, shaking, defeated. I went home that night, feeling more helpless than ever, realizing that he was right. I had tried to be a hero, tried to make a difference, and now I was paying the price. My life would never be the same. A confession from my childhood that still haunts me. A confession from my childhood that still haunts me. I've never told anyone this before, but I feel like it's been eating me alive for years, like something dark and poisonous that I can't keep inside any longer. It all started one summer when I was around 12, back when my parents used to send me to stay with my aunt in this tiny, almost forgotten town a few hours from the city. My aunt's house was an old colonial on the edge of a dense forest, and though it was beautiful, there was something unsettling about it. As a kid, I didn't really understand what bad vibes meant, but that house had them. There was a coldness in some of the rooms, especially the basement. My cousin David was a few years older than me, and though we'd never been particularly close, that summer he was suddenly my only companion. David was strange, though. He would stare at things too long, didn't laugh at any of my jokes, and had a way of drifting into silence mid-conversation, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. But I was 12, lonely, and eager to have any kind of connection, so I ignored all the red flags, chalked it up to him just being different. One afternoon, David asked if I wanted to go into the woods. There was supposed to be an abandoned cabin out there, somewhere deep among the trees, and he said he knew the way. The thing about the woods was they felt like a whole different world. As soon as we crossed the boundary from my aunt's yard, the temperature seemed to drop. The sounds of birds and bugs disappeared, leaving only an unnatural silence that made my skin crawl. But David was determined, and I followed, pretending not to notice the unease settling in my stomach. We walked for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper, until the trees became so dense that barely any sunlight made it through. That's when we saw it. The cabin was old and half-collapsed, covered in moss and vines, hidden so well that you could pass by it 100 times and never see it unless you knew exactly where to look. David told me he'd found it last summer and never told anyone, that it was our secret. He was grinning like he'd just shown me the best surprise of my life, but I remember feeling a cold, prickling fear. I didn't want to go inside, but David grabbed my arm and pulled me in before I could protest. The cabin was dark and smelled of rot, mold, and something else I couldn't quite place. It was filled with strange things, dried-up animal bones scattered on the floor, weird symbols scratched into the walls, and, in the center, a small wooden box sitting on a makeshift altar. I wanted to leave, but David insisted we stay. He told me that he'd found the box last year and that there was something inside it, something powerful, something he hadn't dared to touch yet but wanted to show me. He had this wild look in his eyes, something intense and almost feverish that scared me more than anything else. Then he opened the box. Inside was a tiny, shriveled hand, no bigger than a baby's, curled into a claw-like shape and covered in some kind of dark, dried liquid. The smell hit me first. It was rancid, like old meat left in the sun. David told me it was the hand of the forest spirit, something he'd read about in some old book in my aunt's library, something he said would protect us if we made a pact with it. I wanted to run, but David grabbed my hand and told me to swear on the hand, to promise I'd keep the secret, that I'd never tell anyone about the cabin or the hand or what we were about to do. He said if we didn't swear, the spirit would get angry, and we'd be cursed. At that age, curses felt as real as anything else, so I nodded, whispered the words he told me to say, and let him press my hand onto the shriveled, leathery surface of that thing. It felt wrong, cold and hard, and it left this weird sticky residue on my skin. We left the cabin after that, and for the rest of the summer, David barely spoke to me, acted like nothing happened. I tried to forget it too, but the memory clung to me, lurking in the back of my mind, making it hard to sleep. I remember my mom asking why I'd become so quiet and withdrawn, but how could I explain? When I got back home after summer ended, things started happening. At first, it was small stuff. I'd hear my name whispered when no one was there, see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye. I thought it was just my imagination, that I was being silly, letting my mind play tricks on me. But then the dreams started. In every one, I was back in the cabin, standing before that tiny shriveled hand, only now it was alive, twitching, reaching out for me, whispering my name in this horrible, raspy voice. It got so bad I was afraid to sleep, started seeing the hand in every shadow, hearing it call to me even when I was wide awake. Then, one night, I woke up to find a small, red handprint on my arm, like someone had pressed their fingers into my skin while I slept. I ran to my parents, hysterical, showed them the mark, but they just brushed it off as a bruise or something I'd done to myself in my sleep. No one believed me, and eventually, I stopped telling anyone, kept it all inside. Years went by, and I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, that none of it was real. But then last week, I got a call from my aunt. David had gone missing. She said he'd been acting strange, withdrawn, obsessed with something he refused to talk about. He'd been going into the woods every night, and then one night, he just didn't come back. They searched everywhere, but he was gone, vanished without a trace. That night, the dreams returned, only now, they were worse. I saw David in the cabin, standing before that altar, whispering to the hand, begging it for something. His face was twisted, desperate, terrified, and then he looked at me, reached out, and screamed for help. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of his voice still echoing in my head. Since then, the hauntings have become more intense. I'll catch glimpses of him in the mirror, his eyes hollow, pleading. I can hear the hand whispering in my dreams, telling me it's time, that I have to come back, that I have to finish what we started. I don't know what it wants from me, but I can feel it growing stronger, like it's getting closer every day. I'm terrified to go back to that town, to face whatever waits for me in the woods, but I know it's only a matter of time. Every night, I wake up with that same red handprint on my arm, fresh and raw, like a warning. I can feel it pulling me, calling me back to the cabin, to the hand, to the pact I made all those years ago. And the worst part is, deep down, I know I have to go back. Because if I don't, it's only a matter of time before it comes for me, before it drags me into the woods, just like it did with David. This is my confession, my curse, my childhood sin that still haunts me. I don't know what's waiting for me out there, but I can feel it watching, waiting for the day I finally come back to finish what I started. When my partner and I had our biggest fight, what went wrong? When my partner and I had our biggest fight, what went wrong? It wasn't like we hadn't argued before. In fact, we'd always had what I thought was a passionate relationship. Little disagreements, playful banter that sometimes got heated but would quickly dissolve into laughter or apology, that was us. I thought we had this unbreakable bond, that no matter how bad things got, we'd be able to work through them. But this night was different. I had come home late from work. It was one of those weeks when every project seemed to be falling apart, and I barely slept for days. The house was dark when I walked in, the only light coming from the living room where my partner was sitting on the couch, motionless, staring at the floor. I could feel the tension before I even said a word. Hey, I tried, but they didn't answer, didn't even look up. I could feel something was wrong, but I didn't know why. There had been no recent fights, no simmering issues I could think of, but the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they spoke. We need to talk. I hate those 4 words more than anything because nothing good ever follows them. I took a seat across from them, waiting, trying to read their face, but they looked like someone I didn't recognize. They started listing off things that had bothered them, small grievances that seemed to have piled up, little resentments I didn't know they'd been harboring. The way I'd been distant, the times I'd chosen work over them, the moments I hadn't been fully present. I was blindsided. I thought we were fine, I thought we'd been on the same page, but apparently, all of these tiny cracks had been forming under the surface, and I'd been too oblivious to see them. I tried to explain, to tell them that I didn't know, that I hadn't realized they were feeling this way, but it was like trying to talk to a wall. They weren't listening, or maybe they'd already decided that nothing I said would matter. Then they brought up something that happened months ago, something I thought we'd resolved, but apparently, they'd been stewing on it, letting it fester. I felt this surge of anger then, this bitter resentment that they hadn't come to me sooner, hadn't given me a chance to fix things before it got this bad. I snapped. I'm not proud of it, but I did. I raised my voice, told them that I couldn't read their mind, that if something was bothering them, they needed to tell me instead of holding it in and then throwing it in my face months later. It escalated from there, both of us saying things we didn't mean, hurtful words that we could never take back. They told me they'd been unhappy for a long time, that they weren't sure they could do this anymore. And that's when it happened. I felt something shift, like the ground had dropped out from beneath me, like the person sitting across from me was suddenly a stranger. I looked at them, really looked, and for the first time, I saw someone who wasn't my partner, someone who had all these hidden corners and dark places I'd never noticed. It terrified me. I remember getting up, walking to the window, staring out into the night, trying to calm down, trying to think of anything to say that would fix this, but nothing came. And then, as I stood there, I felt something. It's hard to describe, but it was like this icy hand on my shoulder, this cold weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I turned around, but no one was there. My partner was still on the couch, watching me with this strange expression, like they knew something I didn't. "What's wrong?" they asked, but their voice didn't sound right, didn't sound like them. I shook it off, told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the stress of the fight, but as I looked at them, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Their eyes looked different, darker somehow, and there was this slight smile, like they were enjoying watching me unravel. "Why are you smiling?" I asked, my voice trembling. They looked confused, like they didn't know what I was talking about, but the smile was still there, faint but unmistakable. That's when the room went cold, colder than I thought possible, and I felt this pressure in my chest, like something was squeezing the air out of me. I wanted to leave, to get out of that room, but I couldn't move. My partner started talking again, but the words didn't make sense. They were saying things I'd never told them, secrets I'd kept buried for years, things no one else knew. I tried to speak, to ask them how they knew, but my voice was gone, frozen in my throat. They kept talking, listing off every mistake I'd ever made, every regret, every dark thought I'd ever had, and I could feel myself unraveling, feel my mind slipping. I closed my eyes, told myself to wake up, to snap out of it, but when I opened them, I was alone. The couch was empty, the room silent. I looked around, heart pounding, but there was no sign of my partner. I stumbled to the bedroom, calling their name, but the house was empty. I grabbed my phone, called them, but it went straight to voicemail. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring at the wall, trying to make sense of what had happened, but it felt like hours. Finally, I heard the door open, footsteps in the hallway, and my partner walked in, looking normal, looking like nothing had happened. "Where were you?" I asked, but they looked at me like I was crazy, told me they'd just gone out for a walk to cool off after the fight. I tried to explain what I'd seen, what I'd felt, but they laughed, said I was just stressed, that I'd imagined it. But I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and every time I look at them now, I can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. There's this distance between us, this coldness that wasn't there before, and sometimes, when they think I'm not looking, I catch them staring at me with that same strange smile. I don't know who they are anymore, don't know if they're still the person I fell in love with, or if something else came back with them that night. All I know is that I can't sleep, can't eat, can't think straight. I feel like I'm losing my mind, like whatever I saw that night is still with me, watching, waiting for something. And the worst part? I don't think it's finished with me yet. How I discovered my partner was keeping secrets. How I discovered my partner was keeping secrets. It was a small thing that first made me wonder, something so insignificant that I almost ignored it. I was cleaning up after dinner when I noticed a strange smell in the kitchen, a faint metallic scent that didn't belong. I searched everywhere, thinking maybe a pipe was leaking or something had spoiled, but I couldn't find the source. My partner, Alex, shrugged it off, saying I was probably just imagining it. But I knew my own home, and I knew that smell hadn't been there before. Over the next few weeks, more little things started to pile up. Alex would come home later than usual without an explanation, brushing me off when I asked where they'd been. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find them staring at the ceiling, lost in thought, their face tight with something that looked a lot like fear. And then there was the drawer, the one in our bedroom that I'd never been able to open. Alex had told me it was broken, that the key had been lost years ago, and I'd believed them because why wouldn't I? But now, every time I looked at that drawer, I felt this gnawing curiosity, this urge to find out what was inside. One night, while Alex was in the shower, I couldn't resist any longer. I grabbed a hairpin and went to work on the lock, my hands shaking, my heart racing. After what felt like an eternity, there was a click, and the drawer slid open. Inside was a small wooden box, plain and unassuming. But when I opened it, I felt a chill run down my spine. The box was filled with photographs, all of the same person, a woman I didn't recognize. In every picture, she was smiling, but there was something strange about her eyes, something hollow and haunting. There was also a piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, with what looked like an old address scrawled across it. I shoved the box back into the drawer and locked it, my mind racing. Who was this woman? Why did Alex have these pictures, and why hadn't they told me about her? That night, I confronted them, but they just stared at me, expressionless, and said, "You shouldn't have looked." There was a coldness in their voice that I'd never heard before, and I felt a knot of fear tighten in my chest. They refused to explain, refused to tell me anything more, and I was left with more questions than answers. Over the next few days, Alex became distant, almost like they were a stranger in our own home. They'd disappear for hours, sometimes days, without telling me where they were going, and when I tried to ask, they'd give me this blank, soulless stare that made my blood run cold. I started to dig, desperate to find answers. I searched through every document, every old photograph, anything that might give me a clue, but it was like Alex had erased their past, like they'd never existed before we met. Then, one night, I decided to go to the address on the paper in the drawer. It was a long drive, out to a part of town I'd never been to before, a rundown house at the end of a dark, narrow street. The windows were boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds, but something drew me inside. The house was empty, silent except for the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I wandered through the rooms, my flashlight casting eerie shadows, and that's when I found it, a picture of Alex, taken years ago, with that same woman from the photos. They looked happy, close, almost like a couple. I felt sick to my stomach, my mind spinning with possibilities. Had Alex been hiding an entire life from me? And if so, why? As I turned to leave, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I froze, fear clawing at my throat, but when I turned, no one was there. I ran out of that house as fast as I could, not stopping until I was safe in my car. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw a figure standing in the window, watching me with a look of pure hatred. I barely slept that night, haunted by the image of that woman, by the thought of Alex and the secrets they'd kept from me. The next day, I confronted them again, demanded to know the truth. They just laughed, a cold, empty sound that sent shivers down my spine. "She's not gone, you know," they said, their voice barely a whisper. "She's still watching, still waiting." I didn't understand, but I could see the fear in their eyes, the guilt that they couldn't hide. Over the next few weeks, things only got worse. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find Alex talking in their sleep, mumbling things I couldn't understand, things that sounded like names, places, memories they'd buried long ago. I started hearing strange noises in the house, whispers in the dark, footsteps that didn't belong to either of us. One night, I woke up to find Alex standing at the foot of the bed, staring down at me with a look of pure hatred, their eyes dark and unrecognizable. I tried to speak, but my voice was gone, trapped in my throat. They leaned down, whispered in my ear, "She's never leaving," and then they walked out of the room, leaving me trembling in the darkness. I don't know what happened to Alex, don't know if they're still the person I fell in love with, or if something darker has taken their place. All I know is that our home doesn't feel like ours anymore, that every time I look at them, I see that woman's face, her hollow eyes staring back at me. And every night, I hear her voice, whispering my name, calling me back to that house, to the secrets I was never meant to uncover.